Hi, Kelly. Thank you so much for joining me.
Thanks so much for having me.
So I guess we'll just jump right in. I'm really curious to hear your diagnosis journey. Were you diagnosed with ADHD in adulthood, and if so, what was happening in your own life that led you to kind of think I should really look into this?
Yeah, so it's interesting because I think those of us who are about 35 and older, our parents were a little bit in denial about things growing up, right? So anything mental health related, so depression, anxiety stuff, anything autism or ADHD or anything neurodivergent, my parents were very much of the mindset that you can just figure it out. You don't need help. You don't need therapy. You don't need coaching. You don't need medicine. That was just kind of what it was. And so I remember early on being told that this might be something, or maybe it's anxiety, right? Like, I think that a lot of people with ADHD are misdiagnosed, and that's a huge issue that we go through, especially having a diagnosis of anxiety and things like that into adulthood, and then realizing potentially you actually have ADHD. So I know we all kind of have a different journey on that. But my parents, of course, were the typical boomers and didn't think any of that happened, and then just decided that maybe I ate too much sugar, right? That was like the typical thing that people are told, right? And of course, I had a cousin with ADHD who was on medication, and I saw different ways of treating it around me. However, it was one of those things that I just thought there was something that was kind of broken, right? So I was the type of kid who, and I see this in my daughter, so it's kind of an interesting thing, but I was very critical of myself. I was very hard on myself. I was very perfectionistic. I definitely have rejection sensitivity dysphoria. And so for those who don't have that, you are very sensitive to, any number of things. But if I wasn't perfect, then I wasn't masking it well, then I wasn't, living up to my expectation. And so I went through my whole life like that. Of course, I went to med school and residency, and because you are put in a box so often with ADHD, and your achievements aren't sometimes typical, you try to find this validation elsewhere, right? So my academic achievements were my validation. And so as I was going through life and realizing the things that I struggled with, I had started seeing a therapist because I think, hey, I think everyone should have a therapist or a coach or a trusted colleague or something. And, and I think that when you're married, sometimes you don't always know how to communicate with your partner. And so I think that was, one of the initial goals of this endeavor. But the more I read about things, I was like, I really do think that I still have this ADHD diagnosis. And so I talked with my therapist, and she's like, well, yeah, I mean, I've got that for the last 4 years. So it all just kind of came together, and things started making sense. Like things that we do to cope on our own that is very much because of ADHD that we just don't put together until we officially have like an actual diagnosis. And I think it's actually quite liberating to be able to say, this is the thing that I have, versus feeling like something is broken, right? So I felt like, well, why can't I just do X, Y, Z things, right? Like, why is it so frustrating for my executive function? Like, why do I get overstimulated? Why is it harder for me to transition between things? Why do I have to have all these lists and cross things off and do all these things to keep myself organized? Because my sister doesn't have to do that, right? And the more I thought about it, I realized my dad probably has it. It just, was in denial. And so that really helped me on my journey of being able to have the diagnosis and then realize this is better ways that I can cope with these things.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So, it's funny. I feel like there's also, when you're talking about perfectionism and that high expectation, I feel like I try to figure out, like, is it the messaging that we receive as children from our teachers, especially, right? That idea of like, I saw this a lot in my report cards, like Katie is bright, and then there would be a list of all these deficiencies that I would then internalize and really kind of try, to think of I would think of myself as that version of me as opposed to the version of me that was highly confident, right? And I feel like we have we end up having these high expectations of ourselves in all areas, right? And like, I remember talking to a resident who, when she was diagnosed with ADHD, she was also diagnosed with dyscalculia and the mathematics learning disability. And she was talking about, like, I'm in med school. What is wrong with me that I can't, calculate a tip at a restaurant? And, this idea that you set this bar for yourself, right? Where it's like, I'm in med school, so I should be able to do everything. I have this high expectation of ourselves in all areas. And I'm like, is that specific to a neurodivergent brain to have that, like, high expectation in all areas? Or is that something that we internalize because of the teachers drilling into us that we need to be consistently good in all areas? Or, you know what I mean?
Yeah. And I think it's, the RSD stuff too, right? So I got those things all the time on report cards, right? Or, you talk too much or whatever, right? Because I would get done with my things quickly because it was just kind of like my go and done and hyper focus and get it done, right? Because that actually served me quite well in medical school. But then as a child, then, okay, well, why isn't my friend Brian done with his thing? Because I would like to hang out with him. And so I would help my, best friends with their homework because I wanted them to hurry up so we could, like, go do other things. And even in college, my best friend, since the day I walked onto my college campus, her name's Megan. She's still my best friend. I used to do her homework for her, even though I was not in those classes, because I just needed to do something and needed to get her done so we could go move on with something together, right? And that's just like how, and so I ended up, getting a psych minor because I enjoyed the classes she was taking. And so then went and actually got the credit.
That's hilarious. Yeah, I know. It's really interesting to talk to, women diagnosed in adulthood. And yes, I relate to all of that about, having the parents who just didn't even really understand what neurodivergency is, right? Obviously. But that idea that, like, so much of ADHD is thought of as character flaws. And so I realize how much, like, my struggles would somehow reflect on their parenting. And so, right. And so they would take it as, like, you really need to get your act together. You need to do this. Like, I remember my parents being so frustrated because I had two brothers who got straight A's and did really well. And when I didn't, they were like, well, this is not how our family operate. Like, there was such a sense that it was a reflection of their parenting, because, so much of this is thought of as like character flaws. And
yeah. Well, and I thought that this was like my personality, right? There's a lot of things that are ADHD that I just thought were quirky personality things, right? So, like, I am the person who has piles, right? So I have piles that are organized in my mind. I can pick out a piece of paper. I know exactly where it's at. I know what color pen it was. I know what the scoop is. If my husband took the pile and tried to do something with it, I would probably have a heart attack because he probably put it where it was supposed to be, but I would literally lose my mind because I don't know where this one paper I need for this one other thing and this research thing is because I knew where it was in the pile, right? I just thought that was me. I didn't realize that is such a common thing with people with ADHD until I started doing research on it.
I know, right? I think, my husband and I have been together for 20 years. And I think that was one, when we moved in together, that was probably the one thing we argued the most about. Maybe temperature of the house was this other, I can't, temperature of the house, my impulsive spending. But one of the big things that we argued about and really had to learn to kind of live together was that idea of my organized chaos and how important it was for me to have piles of things that I could remember, and like trying to explain to him that when you take everything and you're being quote unquote helpful and putting everything in a closet or in a drawer or something, you're actually, you're destroying my system, and how important it is for me to, like, see things. And I, never had a language for that until my diagnosis.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And it's so interesting seeing it in a child too then, right? So I'm a mom, I have 2 kids, and my daughter is like mini me and has all the same symptoms. And so we had gone out, well, her room is very much in the piles, right? It's organized chaos, and I get it. And her dad is very frustrated with both of us, but that's, neither here nor there. But, you see some of that perfectionistic rejection sensitivity stuff with all the things she does, right? Like if she's not going to be the best at something, she almost doesn't even want to try, right? So if she's taking piano lessons and she's playing piano and she can't immediately get it, she's angry at herself. And so we have put her in therapy to work on coping skills because she will, hit herself in the head because she's so frustrated. And I remember I used to like pull on my hair when I was upset with myself when I was a kid. But then, that affects relationships with friends, right? And relationships with like coworkers and everyone else that you have in your life, because you just can see it developing. And when we went out for my husband's birthday a couple of weeks ago, we went to a fancier restaurant, which we never do, especially with kids, right? Like it just never happens. And so we're sitting there and I could tell she was trying to be so perfect, right? She's sitting up straight. She's got her napkin. She's got her silverware. She's doing all the things. And then she accidentally spilled water, right? And I knew because of my experience that was going to be a trigger for her because she was so disappointed in herself that she was not perfect when she was trying to be perfect. And so she immediately started crying, and the waiter comes over. It's like, hey, no big deal. I dropped a whole, tray the other day, trying to be the cutest, most wonderful guy ever, right? And he cleans it up and it's all good. But she was so fixated on that moment, which was before we even ate, that she could not enjoy any of the rest of the dinner because she was so mad at herself that she had screwed up. And it was just interesting watching that unfold, because as soon as the water spilled, I knew exactly where her brain was going to go because of the experiences that I had. And so in one way, I think it's great that I had that insight, because my husband just does not get it. He's like, what is the problem? Like, come on. Like,
oh, it's
not a big deal.
It's not. I was just going to say the worst thing you can ever say to somebody with ADHD. It's not that big of a deal.
Yeah. Like, get over it. Like, what is the issue? And it just, I think, and some people are better at learning and using that to gain understanding. I think, her dad is just not quite that insightful, right? Because he has never been around people who have these lovely traits. So it's an interesting experience, but I'm glad that I have what she has, because it definitely helps me be a better mom for her. I think it's nice to have one parent that has the same diagnosis.
Yeah. That reminds me of like when my kids are really upset. One of my pet peeves is when a kid is upset and an adult is like, it's okay, it's not a big deal, it's okay. And I've never understood why that bothered me so much. But for me, I was like, I want to validate that this sucks. This moment that you're in right now, yes, you're right. This is terrible. This sucks. Like that, I feel like that's what a kid needs to hear, or at least that's what I need to hear. And like, it's amazing how in adulthood, how many times we kind of negate a child's gut instinct and gut reactions to things by, telling them that they're wrong, or that what they're feeling is not right, from anything from like stranger danger, right? Sitting on Santa's lap, all of those things that we do to kids. Go hug that crazy old man. Just because he's a distant relative, like all the ways in which we kind of cancel out a child's instincts. And then, we wonder why we grow up to be such balls of anxiety.
Well, and I really think that that's the root of, you're too sensitive, you're too much, you're too whatever, right? Because we're reinforcing that your feelings and your emotions in the situation are not valid, right? So you're overreacting. And so that's what they grow up thinking. That's how I, when I was raised, that's exactly what I thought, that I was just too much of everything. And so then that translates into how you interact with potential partners in the future too. And I never want her to think that she's less than or not good enough or whatever for whatever, guy or girl that she has in her life. Because I don't want that kind of toxic dynamic to play out.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, right. That idea that there is even a wrong way to feel things, for sure. Oh, parenting, so fun. So, how old are your kids?
They're 7 and 9. My daughter's 7.
Oh, those are my favorite ages. I really love it. I always like to say where I'm like, they're old enough to be self-reliant, but still young enough to not be self-destructive.
Yeah, yeah. And I think, that's what was really a wake-up call for me is my daughter was bullied at school and everything else, and we got her official diagnosis, of course then. But when she crossed over to that internalized, almost self-destructive kind of behavior, that's when we were like, I personally couldn't believe that it was already starting at 7, So it's a different journey for everybody. That's for sure.
Mm-hmm. So wait, so was she diagnosed before you were, or you were diagnosed?
So I was like as a kid, and then it kind of like disappeared, right? Because no one cared. I mean, you know how it is.
You outgrow it.
Then I saw it in my daughter, and I was like, okay, I for sure still have this. So it was kind of like in tandem with my daughter.
Yeah.
So then I was talking to my therapist, who was like, oh yeah, well, yeah, you have that. And so we were like, I guess, kind of official at about the same time this year.
Yeah, I know. My kids were both just diagnosed over the summertime, and we had a similar experience because both of my kids are really, really spend a lot of emotional energy keeping it together all day long. And so my son would literally walk through the front door and just burst into tears. But his teacher on all of the teacher reports for the assessment was like, he's a great kid. He's wonderful. He's no problems. He's so well behaved. And I'm like, we see a very different kid.
Oh yeah.
Yeah.
And I think that when my daughter started getting bullied for some of this stuff, right? So I have more of the hyperactivity in my head, right? Mm-hmm. Like meditation is not like an awesome thing for me. My daughter has the constant moving all of the time. She's my little gymnastics girl and can't sit still, right? So her teachers were able to recognize that. They got her a special chair. I mean, they've been fabulous, right? So the school has done a great job with it. However, then she became the target of, kind of some mean girls in class. And it's interesting, a former work colleague of mine's daughter came up to her and just decided to call her ugly. And, so she was just bullied by these kids in class. And that really kind of sent her down this dark spiral of what's wrong with me and more of the sensitivity. And so, of course, it takes forever to get into some of these neuropsych testing and everything else, right? So it took, over 6 months, I think, to get her in to be seen. Mm-hmm. And so then we were able to move forward from that pretty quickly after that. But it definitely is a journey to get the right pieces of the puzzle together.
Good. So that's good. I want to segue then into empathy, because I feel like as a parent, when your child is going through that experience, God, I feel like I'm just like, God, I hate kids. You just want to go to school and you want to beat up the kids who are bullying your kid. You know what I mean? I feel like we have such intense empathy, right, in those experiences. And so I think neurodivergents tend to have an abundance of intense empathy. And I think it's also why so many people in care professions, see where I'm going with this, end up with intense empathy. Social work, healthcare. I feel like I interview so many women where it makes sense, right? Where it's like you end up in these professions because from a genuine sense of wanting to help people, and then you end up completely burnt out. Mm-hmm. And not knowing what to do in that situation. So I know it's something that you talk a lot about, just burnout in general in healthcare. Do you feel from a neurodivergent perspective, I guess, do you feel like your ADHD has lent you, has it helped you more in your field? Is it more of a help or a hindrance?
I think, let's be honest, I think it makes me a really good physician. Okay. So we deal with emergencies amazingly. When I am in a situation in an emergency, I can see all the 150 things that are going on at the same time. There's clarity. You get hyper focused. You're in the zone. That's an amazing thing, right? I think it's challenging because I was in a situation where I was being bullied quite badly. And the issue with me being me, and most of us ADHD people and RSDs and everything else, that is really going to cut into our soul, right? So the culture of healthcare in general is one of significant hierarchy. Don't step out of line. Do what I say, not what I do, all of this stuff. And so for me, I was trying to fix different things, right, in the system to try to make sure the patient safety was dealt with and staff safety was dealt with and everything else. And so on my standpoint, I was trying to do all the right things, right? That doesn't fit in a system because they just want you to shut up and sit down and not make waves and go with the flow and never step out of line, right? And so when you start asking questions, you become a problem person, even if it's an innocent type of situation. And I think that most of us also have a very strong sense of justice that us neurodivergent people all do. And I think that is how I live my life. Like I want things equitable. I want justice for people who are hurt. And so again, I think that makes me a really good physician for my patients. However, it makes me not stand down when we have situations where, in my case, we had a system that didn't want me to report an alleged sexual assault that a patient had made. And of course, I'm going to do what's the right moral, legal, ethical thing for that person. And so we get ourselves into these situations because we really have a strong sense of duty and loyalty and justice. And I think they're amazing qualities. However, it can get us into these traps with existing structures, if that makes sense.
Yeah, I mean, the hospital fired you, right? This was not that long ago. You're still going through this, right?
Yeah, after I reported my boss for bullying, following this whole thing, he was allowed to fire me within that week without any sort of change of behavior, discussion, nothing. And he said that it was his right to fire me. And it was because he could just fire me for no cause, despite the fact that I was seeing the most patients, had the most awards, was the most successful OBGYN, and doing the most community outreach of anyone in our group. So when he fired me, I said, well, why are you firing me? Was there a patient thing? No. Was there a staff thing? No. Was there a safety thing? No. They said it's because of the breakdown in relationship between leadership and you, meaning him and I. And I had literally just reported him for making my life a living hell and picking me apart. And I guess the system decided, you know what? Why fix it? And got rid of me. Or I guess he made that decision ultimately, which I think is a little bit crazy considering the district attorney came out and said that I did the right thing moving forward with reporting the allegation.
Yeah, I mean, obviously there's been like a lot of news coverage around this case. So is he being held accountable or what's the latest?
It's still
going. I don't know how much you can talk about this, so I wasn't sure if I could even bring it up.
I was warned that it could take 4 years. So in my brain, for me to survive this, I have to go, okay, here's my checklist of that. I'm going to compartmentalize it and it's going to be in a box. And when I get things from attorneys or whatever, I will respond. But I have to like put it almost like outside of my body or I could fixate on these things, right? So sometimes I will, like we all do, kind of go down the dark path and ruminate on it and be like, this is crazy that this happened. And where is the justice, right? Like you're trying to have it make sense in your mind and it's not going to make sense, right? And so my sister's like, you just have to decide it's not going to make sense. And that's all you can do. And so I'm trying to kind of leave it over on the side of the road.
Yeah. I mean, it is interesting to think about, like, emotional bandwidth, right? And I think a lot about my own bandwidth when it comes to so many things like boundaries, family, social media, but even just like my bandwidth around, the political climate in this country. And this is a theme that I bring up ad nauseum on this podcast because I'm there, the question that I always come back to where I'm like, is this ADHD or am I just an angry feminist living in this country? Right? Because
It could be.
Because I just feel like it's too much, right? And I'm just like, I feel like, is something else going on? Is this because so many of us are getting diagnosed, especially since the pandemic, where I'm like, there is a lot of small t trauma happening around what is going on in healthcare, what is going on for just women and the Supreme Court and politics, like it's just never ending, racial issues, like it's just a shit show. It's a dumpster fire and it just never ends. And it's like, then I'm sort of wondering, like, are we mistaking this and thinking it's ADHD when this is actually trauma response to being a woman, right? I don't know. I don't know what the answer is.
And here's the thing. I don't, they could be both at the same time. You know what I mean? Like, especially with depression and anxiety, that COVID, if you've had COVID, you do have a higher rate of mental health too, right? And so when you think about it, it's all of these things intermixed. And I've had trauma in my life. And for a while, I thought maybe it was like PTSD, right? Like, because a lot of the symptoms do feel very similar. And to talk about the political climate, with the work I do and the advocacy I do, the horrible thing about my ADHD and the great thing about my ADHD is I say yes to everything. And I think everything's great. And I need to own everything, right? The problem is then you're overcommitted and then you have this overwhelmed moment of, oh my gosh, like, what am I going to do? It's amazing. Somehow I have pulled it out so far. But I went back to school. I'm going to Northwestern Law School for a Master's of Science of Law because I want to be able to work on some of these issues full time. And I think my ADHD has given me that gift and, cross to bear, I guess, because you get so passionate about things that it thrusts you into these situations.
Oh, I know, right? And I think that's what I was meant about bandwidth too, where I was like, I feel like sometimes I have to go into that. You called it compartmentalization, which makes more sense. I'm sort of was like, I feel like it's almost like a dissociative state where, right? Like I was trying to explain to my family, we had planned this trip to go to Maine, at the end of June, and we went to Bar Harbor. I had planned the whole trip because I always plan the trips. I'm the one who's like, we can't sit still, so I'm like, every day I have to have a whole checklist of all the things we're going to do and where we're going to go and all the things. Like, I had been looking forward to this trip for so long. And the night before we were leaving on the trip, the Supreme Court announced, it came out that they were going to announce the overturning of Roe v. Wade the next day. So the morning we left, June 24th, was the same day that they overturned it. And I just couldn't enjoy anything. I had such a hard time. And I was trying to explain, like, people were like, how was Maine when we got back? And I was like, it was terrible. I could not get over how unhappy I was in order to enjoy and be in the moment. And like, I don't know, it just felt like one of those moments of like, I was trying to explain bandwidth to somebody and they were like, their eyes glazed over. They had no idea what I was talking about. But I feel like there is this almost like this mental health survival need to like figure out how to compartmentalize in those moments where we get super overwhelmed by things that are out of our control in that way, right? I don't even know what I'm talking about at this point. You're nodding. You relate to that, right?
Yeah, I mean, I was glad I was coincidentally off that day. Because I took a series of meetings to work on advocacy things for reproductive health. But I don't feel like I would have even been like really in it, right? I was very glad that I was not doing anything patient care related because I was maxed out. Like I think that people who really care about these issues, probably all of us were maxed out. I remember, my sister, she's not neurodivergent and she was, she called me crying, like we're both like looking like a disaster on the phone. Right. So I think it just is more of an exponential issue for those of us who have that passion and that empathy,
Yeah. And then I think also like my instinct is never to like get involved in the fray of social media. And I don't know if that's an age thing. Like I'm about to turn 48. So I sort of feel like I'm like the Gen Xer who just stands back and just stays quiet and doesn't say anything. Cause I'm just like, I am not getting involved in this argument. But like my instinct is never to like, get on angry and get on social media, because that's another thing where I'm like, that adds to the deterioration of my mental health so quickly that like my instinct is always to just like shut it all off and go away and shut it down. But then I'm like, is that being irresponsible? Am I being escapist? I don't know what the word is, but like, I get all wrapped up in like, what is the appropriate public response now that we have social media in the mix, where I'm like, what is my role? What is my job as a human in terms of the public discourse when it comes to these issues? Because I'm just like, I can't, like my mental health cannot handle being open and like talking about it. But there's just been so many moments over the last few years where it's been really important to like join the narrative. And I think I'm probably not alone in like feeling really conflicted about like what is my role, in terms of being vocal. I mean, obviously I have this podcast and I say whatever the hell I want on it. So like, it's not like it's a secret what my politics are, but I just sort of feel like, I don't know, there's those moments where I don't have the bandwidth to react, you know what I mean? In the way that a lot of people are able to do. And I appreciate them for that.
Well, and I think, it's day by day, right? I mean, each of us are on our own journey, whatever that may be. And some of us have sick kids. Some of us have a marriage that's falling apart. Some of us have, and so I think you really just have to read yourself and know what you're capable of, right? And I think that little voice that says, we should do this, we should do that, I think that's really destructive because it is too loud. It negates everything that we actually are feeling and what we actually need. It's that people pleasing, that RSD, the, trying to fit in. That's really the toxic thing that sits inside of us that we can't overcome sometimes. And so I think it's really empowering when you can dissociate a little bit and know yourself well enough to know how this is going to play out and figure out where you want to go from there.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Yeah, I find the concept of boundaries has been fascinating to me since my diagnosis, right? And masking and boundaries, and how really, really difficult it's been to impose them. Yet at the same time, feeling so much happier and healthier as a result. Okay, so I want to talk about your book. Because I could probably ramble for the rest of this interview, but I really want to ask about your book, Delivering, and how, what was the impetus to write such a raw memoir, personal memoir, and kind of share some of your own stories. But you wrote it, I guess it's been almost 2 years at this point. No, it came out last year. Okay.
Yeah. But the whole book writing thing is a process, right?
Yeah.
So I wrote it shortly after COVID started. And I guess, hearing the disconnection between everyone and hearing my patient stories and how they feel so alone with different things, right? I mean, I hear about abuse and I hear about assault and I hear about miscarriages and I hear about like all of the things, right? Because I take care of women through their whole life. And whenever I have someone that comes in to talk about a miscarriage, for example, everyone feels alone, right? I don't think that we're doing enough to share our stories so that people feel supported and like they actually have a team behind them. Because especially during COVID, like I said, everyone was just kind of disconnected. People weren't seeing each other. People weren't talking on the phone as much. We had a lot more depression. And especially my postpartum patients had a super high rate of anxiety and depression, especially my first-time moms who are just kind of like in this, shell trying to deal with this baby. And so I wrote this because I wanted to shed some light on some of these issues and talk about my experiences and be like, if I can talk about my stuff, you can talk about your stuff. Like, there's nothing to be ashamed of or embarrassed about, because this is life. This happens. And the other thing that I wanted to stress is we carry a lot of the shame for things, right? So in my book, I talk about when I was sexually assaulted, and it took me until adulthood to be able to discuss this, right? Like, I told my husband when we were early dating, kind of like a very abstract version, like, here's a disclaimer. But I mean, really, I didn't even tell my sister, who's my best friend, until years later. I had told my mom, who didn't want me to report it because she was running for political office at the time. However, it's interesting because we carry so much of that shame and guilt, and it is so freeing when we can actually realize that it's not our fault and we're just humans living our lives and we're not alone with the situation.
Yeah, I was also molested as a child by a family member, and I've spoken openly about it. But I often found, like, a lot of the work that I've had to do in therapy has been the trauma around the reactions of people, not the actual molestation or the sexual assault. It's been the way in which I was treated by trusted family members, especially my parents, and their reaction to the assault, and just like the idea of that, it was that the implied guilt, and the victim blaming, and a lot of the idea of, like, we don't want to bring charges against this family member because we don't want you to have to deal with the guilt that you will feel if we bring charges upon this family member. And then as an adult being like, what the fuck was that about? Right? Right.
I mean, I can't imagine as a mom now,
right,
saying things that my mother had said to me. I mean, the blame and the games and how it reflects on her, that was the only concern, right? And then it just didn't happen. So it's like, okay, here's the recipe of how this is your fault, and it's going to reflect on me if you do anything. So we're going to pretend like it never happened. And, like, when I look at my kids, I mean, if they told me one iota of that scenario, I'd be calling the police. We'd be having a little chat. I'd be calling my attorney. I'd be figuring out what the next steps were. Like, I would burn it down for them, So it's hard for me. But again, we are more passionate, empathetic people by nature in the ADHD world. And so am I feeling that because of that trauma and the reactions to it? Or am I feeling that because of this, neurodivergence? I don't know. Right. So it's an interesting thing to know. Did the trauma shape us, or did these other things shape us?
Right. And I feel like I have yet to meet a woman who doesn't have some sort of sexual trauma in her past, and then it's like, okay, how do we even start to untangle what of this is this ADHD the result of trauma, or is this genetic? Or one of my pet peeves is when a woman goes to her doctor saying, I think I have ADHD, and the doctor says it's probably just childhood trauma masking as ADHD, and I'm like, what even is that? Like, how is that helpful? Right?
There's a lot of denial thing, right? I mean, there's still OBGYNs in my area who won't treat postpartum depression and anxiety, right? It's the whole patriarchal, oh, it'll go away, whatever. I've had patients transfer to me saying how a male physician just kind of minimized their symptoms and wouldn't deal with it, right? So we still have many physicians who are not willing to have the important conversations.
Oh my goodness. See, yeah. So I'm like, oh God, so angry. Oh my God, I'm so worked up. So okay, tell me about Patient Care Heroes too, because I feel like that's such a lovely organization. When did that start, and what is the sort of main MO behind it?
Yeah, so during COVID, of course,
You're
was
busy.
one of my COVID projects. I talked to a lot of people around the country to kind of see what the needs were, what their experiences were. And so the January after COVID started, right? So it'd been like 10 months-ish or so, or 9 months, I called one of my friends, Naveen Goyal, and I said, do you want to do an organization with me? Because he's a CEO of a company and he does this stuff, right? And I said, this is what I want to do. And so I wanted to be a support team for healthcare workers. And I use that broadly, right? So I started my career as a CNA. When I say healthcare workers, I mean physicians, nurses, CNAs, medical assistants, whoever, right? Like I'm not going to, pinpoint one particular group, but I wanted to be kind of a security blanket for people. I knew that the rates of physician and nursing suicide were going to go up, and they have. I knew the rates of burnout were going to go up, and they have. I was worried about people leaving and putting more pressure on the remaining healthcare workers, which of course all came true. And so I wanted to provide mental health resources for people, a safe place to kind of gravitate to talk. And of course, because the needs were so much for that, we didn't really expand much more than that at this moment. But the goal is to provide resources for a variety of other things down the line, right? So we just haven't got past the mental health component because that's been such a immediate need for people.
Mm-hmm. Well, and how do you even begin to advocate for yourself? Like, okay, so say there's like an incredibly burnt out physician who's listening to this episode right now, and you're talking about that kind of top down, stay in line culture, right? That's in healthcare. What advice do you even give to healthcare workers who just have lost that, who they're just totally burnt out and running on fumes and overwhelmed?
And I think most of us have thought about leaving, right? Mm-hmm. And just because we're ultimately tired of being treated in a certain way. And I mean, first and foremost, if you're having negative thoughts, you're thinking about suicide, just quit your job. I mean, honestly, you will find another job. Your job will replace you. If you are in such a toxic environment that you're thinking about dying by suicide, you need to, call your sister, your friend, whoever it may be, and you need to get out of that situation. Because honestly, in my last work situation, I was being bullied so much, you just get to this dark place and you feel like, okay, well, I'm just going to die in this job. Like I'm going to either stroke out or something bad's going to happen because it's so overwhelming. And so I think that people don't see a way out. And the other thing that I think is so interesting in the medical culture is we are judged if we leave a job and go to a different job, right? So you're almost seen as like damaged goods, if you will. Like, well, what's wrong with you? You couldn't suck it up in the system. Like, what's the problem? Well, it was pretty terrible. But now everyone's thinking, okay, well, what's wrong with her that she couldn't just fall in line and do her thing? And so that is what a lot of us have playing in our mind. And really, who cares? Just get out of the situation. If you're struggling, we will help you. We just need you to be safe. That's the number one thing, right? However, I will tell you, being in a different program, being in a different system, being with different leadership sometimes is all you need. Because I really thought, okay, do I want to be in clinical medicine anymore? Or do I want to leave clinical medicine? Am I upset because of, do I hate my job or do I hate how I was treated, right? It's hard to dismiss those things. It's hard to separate the two things. And so for me to really decide, okay, I still want to be in clinical medicine, I took a variety of different jobs around the state of Minnesota and I started enjoying clinical medicine again. And I will tell you, it was so interesting being in like 5 different systems, and each one of them was better than where I was. Like they had good leadership. They actually cared about people. They were there to support you. The partners were awesome. And I thought, okay, that was just a thing. That is not all the people. It would help me put things in perspective, because when you are in the dark hole, you think, oh my gosh, what if I leave and it's worse? And that's what I hear all the time too. What if I leave this job and it's actually like more abusive and worse schedule and everything else? And that's not going to be the case. If you're that miserable, it's not going to be the case. You just need to leave. And I know a lot of my colleagues and friends have left and they're infinitely happier. And the thing that I have learned about myself is I'm probably just a private practice person, right? Because I can actually make the change in my group and everything else. And so because of everything I've gone through, I've made myself back to private practice. And I think that that's just a healthier environment for me because I actually am not seen as a random cog in a wheel and have no say in what happens to my patients.
Yeah. So, I mean, with the great resignation that's happening right now, do you feel like, what do you think is going to be the outcome? Because there's all of those doomsday articles that are like, you young people, you're going to regret this. Uh, but as somebody who's self-employed and has quit in anger from many jobs over the course of the last 20 years, like, I'm like you. I'm like, yeah, change, get the hell out of there, get a change of perspective. You never regret it. But I can also see that, why there's that fear of like, oh, maybe this isn't the greatest idea.
Well, I think that they do that to make you afraid, right? They're trying to take away your power. And I really believe that things happen not everything happens for a reason. I won't say that because I can go on a whole tirade about medical things that I do not believe happen for a reason. But I think in our work careers, things tend to fall in place that need to fall in place. And so for me, this situation really was the push I needed to leave a toxic situation that I was miserable in. And, now I'm using that to get another degree and work on some of these issues and everything else. And I really think that when we're trapped in these situations, we can't see ourselves or the situation clearly. And getting other people's perspective on it is really critical. I have some really good friends here. Well, Michelle Chesovich is another physician, and Shireen McConnell, and they were like, okay, you're miserable. It's probably good that you're leaving, regardless of how it happened, because this was literally killing you. But when you are the person, you can't see it. And so I have no regret about my situation. And I really don't think anyone who quits because of abuse or toxicity or maybe malignant partners or whatever the case may be, I don't think you're going to regret it, because it really is an opportunity for you to grow. Even if you go, well, maybe I overreacted, or maybe that person wasn't as bad, you're still growing and you're still learning about yourself and you're still figuring out what you want in your future.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, very well said. I'm dying to ask if you saw the BBC show "This Is Gonna Hurt," the Adam K show.
I have not.
Oh my God! You definitely need to watch the show. I think it's based on his book, right? It's so intense, but I feel like so much of what we've talked about in terms of plus being an OBGYN and just being like private practice versus the NHS, and it's a really intense show. I think my husband and I binged it. It was one like we just like. Even, it didn't matter how late it was. We were like, we have to see the next episode. But it's really intense. Oh, well, okay. I was just curious if you had seen it.
Well, I think, so for someone who's like trying to be more optimistic and positive, I wanted to watch it, but I felt like I needed to be in the right headspace for me to actually absorb any of that in a okay way and not be like hysterically crying or something. It just sounded like so much of everyday life for us right now that it was too much to take in.
Yeah, I can see that for sure. And I'm sure it would really hit close to home, or what's the word? Like close to the bone? Is that even a phrase? Close to the bone? No, whatever.
Phrases At the Minnesota Hair, I learned that things I say are from Wisconsin and people look at me like I'm an alien. So
I love it. Okay, so let me see. What else? Did I have any other questions about? Gosh. Okay, so I guess I'm curious. So I asked you about. We talked about your childhood, and even kind of what you love about your ADHD, at least in the medical field. That's what you were reminding me of. Like when you were talking about starting Patient Care Heroes, I was like, with ADHD, we don't have hobbies. We start companies.
Things at one time, right? Like I joined a bunch of boards and I'm going back to school and I'm joining a new practice, but that's when I'm my happiest. Like if I have slowed down to where I am unable to engage and do other things, then I'm like very depressed and non-functional. You know what I mean? I think that you can easily go to that place where you're just done. And I think that in the political climate and the COVID world and all that kind of stuff, I definitely have had those days where I'm like, I can't do anything.
Oh yeah, totally. Yeah. And not only that, but like I can sort of absorb, I'll take on new projects. And then once those projects become kind of almost like automated, or they become like, they sort of move into the background of my brain where I'm still doing those things. I haven't taken on, it's not like it's less work. It's just like easier work. So then I take on something new that's part of the like interest dopamine part of my brain, right? So I'm like, the podcast parts, there's a lot of the podcasts that in the beginning, there was like a really steep learning curve because I was like learning how to edit and do all this stuff and which microphone should I buy, right? And so now I'm like, okay, that steep learning curve is gone. It's become an easier effort. So now I'm like, okay, I think I should go back to school and get another degree. So that's what I'm doing now. I'm also going to grad school because I'm like, now I'm bored. What is the new thing I'm going to do?
The ADHD people get that though, because my husband just thinks I'm crazy. So that's a whole other thing.
I know, right? Well, I've been making fun of my husband because he, I've had so many jobs over the last 20 years, and he's really worked at 2 companies since I've known him. And he just had his 10-year anniversary at the company he's currently at. And so he got the catalog, which I've never gotten because I've never lasted that long anywhere. But he got the catalog that was like, congratulations, you've worked for us for 10 years. Let's celebrate. And there was like, pick out your choice of a juicer or free luggage. And he chose a Fitbit. And I mean, great, Fitbits are great, but I was like, really? Like, is this supposed to be a celebration at this moment where you get a Fitbit in the mail for 10 years of service?
That's kind of a big downer.
I know, right? I know, but I was like, I'm not jealous in the least. No. So I've been making fun of his anniversary Fitbit. So now I do want to ask you if you could rename ADHD to something that's a little less confusing. Have you thought about what you might call it?
It's such a complex thing, so until you really know the different parts of it and the ways it affects you, it's very hard to almost classify it. I think that there could be more types than there are. I haven't really thought about that a whole lot though, but I honestly feel like for me and my daughter, for example, the RSD and the feeling stuff, and that is a more heightened part of my life than a lot of ADHD people. So I do think we would be better served to have more segments underneath ADHD, just so that we can have more clarity around how it's affecting different people, because that might in some ways help bosses and work and help you explain things to coworkers, just so that you don't feel like such an outlier, if that makes sense.
Oh yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think the vast majority of us come to understand ADHD through the emotional elements and not only the RSD, but the emotional overwhelm and how that relates to, or the emotional dysregulation and how that relates to sensory overload, right? And that for me was like a huge light bulb moment, and none of that is in the DSM.
No. Well, even if we said something like executive functioning dysregulation and brain hyperactivity, I think that would even be better, because people just have this stereotype of a little kid who's basically like my daughter sometimes is, right? And so I don't think we do enough to communicate through the diagnosis what it is so that people can understand.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Yeah. And I think also then it comes back to like the degree, like how much is it affecting you, right? I think there's such an emphasis in the DSM about struggle and lifelong struggle and evidence of struggle. And it's like, how do we even begin to unpack evidence of struggle when you have kids who are like holding it together and then they come home and they burst into tears? So I'm like, where's the evidence of struggle there in terms of the classroom? Nowhere. But, we're all getting diagnosed with anxiety because we're barely holding it together. So when your physician says there's no evidence of struggle throughout your childhood, you're like, yeah, because I was really good at masking.
And then I went in my room and I cried. And then I mean, what?
I know, right? Yeah, exactly. I'm like, I've been in therapy my whole life. That's, Well, I always appreciate having conversations about how complicated it is. It's very validating to me when I talk to other, like, very clearly intelligent women about how, how complicated and confusing it is. Because then I'm like, I'm not, because I'm like, okay, at least I'm not alone in that, where, because I still feel like, what am I Am I missing something? Because I feel like the more I talk about it, the less I understand. And so I find it very, I find it very comforting when other women also don't really understand what even is going on here, and how do we even begin to kind of unpack, as Emily Donahoe always called it, the bowl of fish hooks, right? Trying to figure out what is going on here. So, well, I appreciate your candor and all of your, amazing things that you're doing for the healthcare community, and was just so pleased that when you reached out because I'm so thrilled to have a conversation with you and get to hear your own story. So thank you so much, Kellie.
Well, thanks so much for having me.